1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam? Welcome to the week 4 edition of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host. I am your guest. I am JMToWin. As always, throw this baby on 1.5x speed or 2x speed, and let's get started with kind of a unique week. We've got a lot of injury situations. We are still waiting to see how those shake out. We have an NFL that has changed the way that they are playing defense and how that affects our DFS play, how that affects offenses. We've talked a lot about this over the last few weeks, what that means for how we want to attack things. And then we have a unique slate where we've got really a bunch of 12 game slate, a bunch of games that have pretty low totals. A lot of those have very few paths to shooting out. We have one game in the Commanders and Cardinals that just looks like it stands head and shoulders above everything else. Almost feels like a can't fail type of game. We will get to that one. We will talk about the ways in which it can fail. We will talk about the ways in which it can succeed. We'll talk about how we can build for success in both potential scenarios. And then obviously, if that game were to fail, how would we succeed on the weekend? Well, it would probably be from another game ascending. So we'll also talk about some of the games that could ascend this week. So last little note here before we dive in. Well, actually, last little note. Welcome to those of you who are new to this show, to this podcast, whether you are watching on YouTube, listening on a podcast player. We do this every Friday. Also check out the 1 week season podcast feed. That's 1 week season. You just look for it on your favorite podcast player. You get the NFL Edge game breakdowns. Those are totally free. Those come out on Friday mornings. Searching for Ceiling with Lord Reeves from Sharp Football Analysis and with Hilo from OWS. You get the DFS Lab every morning of the week where we take about 30 minutes building a roster. So lots of good stuff on that podcast feed. Absolutely free. So be sure to check that out throughout the week. Okay. So first off, I just want to reiterate what we're seeing throughout the NFL and talk about why it's real. Oh, I didn't hit that last note. And that is kind of related to my last note. My last note, just a reminder, this is a solo podcast on video. So I've got notes. I know where I'm going with this, but there could be a little break at some point while I try to figure out where I'm at in my notes, or as my thoughts branch off and I try to pull them back to where I was. We've been pretty smooth through the start of the season. The deeper into the season we get, the more practice we get, the smoother it gets. I've been happy with the way things have gone so far, but I just want to drop that at the top just in case we have any little lumps throughout this one. Okay, so what we are seeing in the NFL and why it's real. So what we're seeing, and again, we've covered this in depth over the last couple of weeks. We especially dove deep into it. I believe it was in the Winner Circle podcast in week 2, which is for Inner Circle members. But the basic gist of it is that NFL teams build often for what is successful. And in fact, we can even zoom out and say, not every GM is perfectly equipped to be a great GM. Not every, something we talked about last week. A lot of coaches develop their reputation through a certain scheme. And that scheme might work because of the players that they have in that scheme. And that's not to say that they're not good coaches. That's not to say that they don't run that scheme really well, but it is to say that when they move out of that scheme and they don't have the best players for that scheme, they're not able to adapt and just say, okay, now these are the pieces we have, so this is what we'll do differently. And so a lot of these coaches build their reputations off of being good at one thing. And then if that one thing gets taken away, then maybe they're not good coaches anymore. A lot of these GMs don't necessarily know how to build a team, or owners don't necessarily know how to, make the decisions they're supposed to be making. Bill Walsh used to say that the 49ers were typically competing against about 7 or 8 teams for the Super Bowl each year. In other words, the rest of the teams in the NFL's time when there was 28 teams in the NFL, I believe was still the case back then. So it's basically saying like the other 20 teams in the NFL literally had no shot at winning a Super Bowl because they just did not know what they were doing. And that has continued to be the case throughout the years, right? Where a lot of teams across the NFL, whether it's organizational from the top down or kind of that second step down of the GM on down, don't necessarily know what they're doing from a team building perspective. And sharper football minds, including sharper GMs, sharper coaches, might look at those teams from afar and say, I don't get what their process is here. So over the last, 5-6 years, and we talked about, the proliferation of the Seattle 3 scheme that these coaches kind of branched out from Seattle, and other teams started kind of trying to adapt this. And the reason why it worked so well in Seattle was because of the individual pieces they had in Seattle. And again, that defense was very much a defense of, we don't change what we do. We don't blitz much. We don't rotate. We don't shift sides with our players. We don't, nothing changes. It's static. We practice this in the same places every day. Our defense moves on a string together, and we're so good at it that you have to come beat us. And that worked for the Seahawks because of the players that they had. But as those coaches started to go out and get jobs with other teams, it didn't work quite as well. And so the downfield passing attack just really opened up over the years. And the NFL went through a stage where downfield passing was a big part of the week-to-week experience of the NFL. So obviously during that time, the talk was, well, because of all the rules that favored the offense, and because of the rules to protect the quarterback and all these things, like, of course, offense is exploding. But there was also a big function of that was these teams had built specifically for being able to beat the types of defenses that were out there. And that meant building explosive offenses that neglected the run, that neglected unique run blocking concepts and run schemes that could throw off a defense, that neglected, higher end running backs, or at least neglected building a system like Shanahan's system that kind of you can plug any good, like one cut and go running back into that system and they can do well. And so the run game kind of took a back seat, passing attacks took over. And now we've seen defenses starting to fight back. And it really started 3 years ago when teams started going out of their way to attack the Bengals and the Chiefs with a lot of cover 2. And then last year we saw that spreading even more throughout the NFL, and it was a really low scoring year compared to what we were used to. And then this year it has been like another step up for the defenses. And so it's the reason why it's real is because most of these teams have offensive coaches that were hired for the success that they had in the past against past styles of defenses, and then maybe they're not able to adapt to the defense that they're facing now, or they have built their teams to attack past styles of defenses that they're not seeing as much of now. So who benefits is what we want to be asking at this point. Who benefits from this change in the way the defenses are playing? Who is able to succeed? So one thing that we've seen going back to last year is we've continued to see success from Shanahan offenses and Shanahan proteges. So Bobby Slowick over with the Houston Texans being a good example of a Shanahan protege who has been able to take that system and continue to have success away from San Francisco with that offensive scheme. Obviously very creative offensive coaches, adaptable offensive coaches. You remember Sean McVay when he first came into the league. The rest of the NFL ran 11 personnel at say 67 to 70% of the time, 11 personnel being 3 wide receivers, 1 running back, 1 tight end. And Sean McVay, there was a season where they ran 11 personnel, I think it was 97% of the time. And that was Sean McVay's offense. And then in that Super Bowl, Belichick put together a blueprint of, actually it was earlier in the year, and I forget who it was. It might have been Vic Fangio, but somebody had slowed down the Rams. Maybe it was Rex Ryan. I don't remember who it was, Rob Ryan. Somebody had slowed down the Rams. And then Belichick took that blueprint, adapted it for what the Patriots were good at, built on that blueprint, and then slowed down the Rams in the Super Bowl. And the next year, teams were continually throwing that at the Rams, and Sean McVay was able to start adjusting and building his offense in a different way. And so there's huge risk that comes with these coaches who don't have a system. Sean McVay has more of a system than some of these other non-system coaches, but there's huge risk in these coaches who don't have a system, and they're just going to outmaneuver the opponent, because if they're not able to do that with the pieces that they have, Josh McDaniels is a good example of that, or if they can't get buy-in from their players, well, then their ability to outmaneuver their opponent on a week-to-week basis kind of evaporates, and now they don't look like a good offensive coordinator. There are guys like Shane Steichen, who he has a long track record of wherever he is, Shane Steichen, Colts head coach, long track record of wherever he is with varying personnel, being able to adapt the way that he's building that offense in order to succeed based on the weapons that he has and the way that defenses are attacking them. And so who benefits are coaches who are adaptable, a Shane Steichen, a Sean McVay, or teams that have built themselves for this type of defense. Really interesting example of this is the Buffalo Bills, who since Joe Brady took over last year, they put a much heavier emphasis on the run game. Then this year got rid of Stephon Diggs, got rid of Gabe Davis. People said, oh, where's their offense going to come from? They've got Keon Coleman, who the Bills have likened to a Michael Thomas, but obviously he's more of a sideline guy, body control type guy than Michael Thomas necessarily was used as with the Saints. But then you've got Curtis Samuel, who's kind of the gadget / underneath guy. You've got Khalil Shakir, who, as we hypothesized coming into the year, has emerged as really the alpha target on this offense, but primarily, a shifty get open against man, get open against zone coverage type of slot guy, almost like a Julian Edelman type player, right? Who can hit some big plays if he gets the ball in his hands in space, but really his value is that he gets open all the time on underneath throws. And for the way the defenses are fighting back, there's a lot of value in the way that the Bills have built their offense to attack this year. They're being able to run the ball, that's kind of the thing with cover two, is if you can successfully run the ball, then that forces the defense to get out of cover two, bring that extra safety into the box. And then if you can work the underneath areas of the field, you don't need to be attacking downfield. And then obviously you've got Josh Allen with his legs that can always do something as well. And so teams that are able to adapt, teams that are able to, or that have gone out of their way to build in a specific way that fits for the way the defense are playing right now. And then teams that are facing other opportunities for us to see offense emerge this season. And this will develop throughout the year, and we'll update our thoughts as the season moves along. But our teams that are facing defenses that can't or won't adjust to what is working across the NFL. So an example of a defense that won't adjust is the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are running man coverage at anywhere from like a 55 to 65% clip, just far and above all the other teams in the NFL. They did it against Miami in week one, which is a team that everybody knows. You don't play man coverage against Miami. And they actually did a good job of it. That might have been a bad thing for them. It's like we talk about when somebody has a big win in DFS playing in a negative EV type of way, and that just permanently stamps in their mind that, oh, okay, this is the way to play DFS. And they end up losing all that money back and more and wondering when the next big weekend is coming. And it's like, well, things just fell into place for you. It was a low likelihood way to win. You ended up winning, and that ended up hurting you because you thought that this was the way to win, and it's not. Like, it's going to lose you money over time. Well, the Jags kind of in a similar situation, and they slowed down Miami in week one. Tyreek Hill had that big play, but if Travis Etienne doesn't fumble on the 1 yard line, Jacksonville comes out of that game 1-0. Miami comes out of that game 0-1. That allowed Miami to get the ball back, hit that big play to Tyreek Hill, get back in the game, end up winning that game. Jags only lost that game 17-20 against that really good Miami offense. It was obviously still healthy at the time with Tua. Then they played Cleveland in week 2, and Cleveland's not a great offense, kind of bottom of the league in most advanced metrics in pass blocking, in passing efficiency, and basically everything across the board. And then they played Buffalo, and Buffalo was like, oh, you're going to play man coverage against us? Watch what we're going to do to completely wreck your man coverage concepts. And Jags could not stop Buffalo at all. Well, every expectation should be that the Jags are going to continue to do that this week against Houston. So teams that will not adapt what they're doing to what will actually work best are teams that we can continue attacking. And then teams that are incapable of stopping opposing teams, which is, for example, the Washington Commanders, who really have been the most attackable defense in the NFL, and that may not continue for the entire season, right? Teams grow and they get better as the season moves along. That is part of what the NFL is all about, but they are not at a place right now where we should have any fear about them. So teams that will not update what they're doing, and teams that cannot stop opposing offenses, those are the teams that we can gain a lot of value from attacking at this point in the season, because we have most defenses winning the battle against offenses. So what ends up happening, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll use my hands to show it, but I'll also say it in such a way that you'll hopefully grasp it, is like most of the games are being held down here. So then when the other games do well, it's not that they're just here, right? Just a little bit above the other games, but they can be way up here, even without a super high scoring game. You can have a game in which 55 total points are scored, and that can separate so much from the other games that it ends up making a huge difference in your ability to make money. And so finding those spots that have potential to separate is going to be a big part of what we can be looking for, throughout the season, especially more specific to what will help us right now, what we should be looking for here right now in week 4 in the early going of the season. So to branch off of a couple of those spots really quickly, I think of this Texans offense really interesting this week. Obviously, we've got all of my DFS interpretations in the NFL Edge, where I break down my player pool thoughts from all the games. We have my player grid, which by the time you're watching this or listening to this should be live in the scroll on the site, where you have my player pool for the week. So I'm not going to go too deep. Again, we try not to double up on content and information between the Angles podcast and the player grid, but I want to touch on a couple spots really quickly. I think that this Texans offense is really interesting. Looks like Nico Collins is going to play. Tank Dell is not going to play. So we have a similar situation to last year. And I want to kind of go through some numbers real quickly. Last year, 9 out of 17 weeks, one or more. There was the Tampa week where 3 Texans pass catchers hit. But so we'll just say the other 8 times one pass catcher hit. So 9 out of 17 weeks, at least one pass catcher from the Texans went for 30-ish or more DraftKings points, went for a score that would fit onto a tournament winning roster or would directly help you. A lot of these 37-point scores from Nico Collins in there that would directly help you win a tournament. So 9 out of 17 weeks. Okay, so let's talk about DraftKings pricing a little bit. If you've been around OWS for years, you have heard this, but also you're not grinding NFL DFS thoughts throughout the offseason, so you might have even forgotten about this. And if you're new here, this is critical information to pick up. So how does DraftKings pricing work? Now, I always speak in generalities here because this is not across the board 100% how things work, but generally speaking, DraftKings is going to price players such that they will hit roughly 4x their salary, roughly 1 out of every 4 weeks. So about 20 to 25% of the time, somebody who's 5K is going to go for about 20 points. So there are some inconsistencies in the way that DraftKings handles this. One example is players who almost never hit that 4x mark, but are usually somewhat popular regardless. And a lot of times DraftKings will end up keeping their price elevated because people tend to keep going to them at that price tag. So you'll see these guys who, Chris Olave is a good example. He's topped 22 points 3 times in his career. He's never topped 27 DraftKings points. And yet he's priced in this range where, really he should be hitting about 25 points 1 out of every 4 games, right? And I forget what the numbers were. He's played like 34 games or something like that. And he's gone above 22 points only 3 times. So less than 10% of the time across 34 games. Now, obviously Chris Olave is capable of putting up a 30, 35 point game. But in terms of how DraftKings pricing usually works, Chris Olave should be priced more in like the mid to high 5Ks. But because he tends to draw ownership attention, even though his price doesn't really or his past production has not justified this price tag, they kind of keep his price tag there. Then we get the guys who maybe don't hit 1 out of every 4 weeks, 1 out of every 5 weeks, but when they do hit, they end up hitting for something far higher than their salary multiplier. So this would be a player who is, 5,900 and they don't go for 24 points every 4 or 5 weeks, but every once in a while, they have like a 32 or 35 point game. We see this sometimes at running backs. Aaron Jones is a good example of a player like this who, he'll have these or he'll have these 50 point games or 40 something point games. And it's like, well, we can't price him down at 5,500 because that's way too cheap for this guy's ceiling. So we have to price him a little bit higher because when he hits, he can hit for such a high score. And so, yeah, he doesn't hit as frequently as some other guys, but when he hits, he can hit for these super high scores. Then we have the guys who, DJ Moore is a good example of this, the guys who do hit kind of, or Amari Cooper, right? They do hit more frequently than that 1 out of every 4 games, or they hit as frequently as that 1 out of every 4 games, but then hit for like a much higher than just purely 4x number and really aren't priced where they should be priced. But because they don't draw the ownership attention of some of the other guys, DraftKings ends up not bumping up their prices. Guys like that are really valuable to look toward in tournaments because we can find those high-end scores. There was one other exception that I'm not finding here in my notes, and so we'll skip over it. And that's part of this video solo pod component. But so then let's take the Texans, right? So if you've got 2 guys, and so this offense last year hit 9 out of 17 times. This year it's already hit once. So through 20 regular season games, that's 10 out of, because Nico had a 30-point game. So 10 out of 20 games, 50% of the time, you've been getting like a 30-ish plus point score from a wide receiver on this offense. And then if there's just 2 wide receivers to choose from, you basically have a 25% chance of guessing correctly on one of these guys. So that basically puts you in line with where DraftKings prices players. But where's the value in that, right? Why are these guys more valuable than some other places? Well, there's 2 parts to this. One, they can hit for such huge scores that they're truly tournament winning types of scores. So it's not like they're just going, because we use this 4X pretty loosely. If a guy were priced at 7K and he's hitting 25 points and 26 points, like we would kind of count that in this bucket. And then like the 29 to 30 pointer. And it's rare that they're really going for those 35, 37 point scores. Well, the Texans offense produces these like huge scores at a higher rate than other offenses produce these huge scores. And then on top of that, in places where, if the Texans have done this 50% of the time since the start of last season, in places where the game environment and matchup are such that the chances of it happening are elevated, well, then the EV, the expected value of that, is also elevated. And so in this spot against this man-heavy Jags team, important divisional game, this is a spot where we could see, one of these 30 plus point scores emerge from Nico Collins or Stephon Diggs, making them very interesting pieces this week. And I'm spending a lot of time talking about these guys. I'm not spending this time because these are far and away my favorite plays on the slate. These are plays that I really like this week. And we'll touch on them in the player grid. You'll see where I have them ranked, but more because I'm more spending this time on this because it's valuable to talk through some of these things. And these things are often easier touched on in this audio format than in writing. And so just a good way to kind of talk through how pricing works, some of the things we can look at, and some of the ways we can think about the expected value that we are adding to our rosters. And then an example of a defense, as we mentioned already, a defense that can't stop other teams right now is Washington. So in a year of defense, Washington doesn't have one. And right now, so far, their games have been something of a cheat code. And honestly, even if this Cardinals Commanders game misses this week and you're heavy on it and it misses, the Cardinals end up kicking a bunch of field goals, or little things can happen that completely wreck the scoring that we're looking for in a game. So the Commanders could pick up a bunch of yards. The Lions did it against the Buccaneers in week 2. You could pick up a bunch of yards and then have mistakes in the red zone that lead to you kicking field goals. Maybe you have one turnover in the red zone, and then you have a penalty that turns a 2nd and 7 into a 2nd and 17, and that ends up being a field goal. And then maybe a guy drops a pass on a 3rd and 4 that should have given you the first down and gotten you closer to the end zone. Maybe it was even dropped in the end zone, and that's another field goal. And so, or you take a sack and knocks you out of field goal range. Like all these little things where the Cardinals are going to move the ball on the Commanders. The question is just, do they get the touchdowns? They probably do, but there are clear pathways to that not happening. And if that ends up being the case, that really doesn't hurt us that much. That will lose us money this week if you're betting on that game environment. But that will be such a popular game environment that might lead people to be less invested in Washington's opponent the next time around, which gives you opportunity to make the money that time. There are going to be more games this year in which Washington is unable to stop their opponent. So because of all this stuff with defenses and the way that things are shaping up in that regard, teams, players that can separate become that much more valuable. So again, if we have 12 games on the slate and 9 of them finish with combined scores of 43, 45 points, 40 points, 39 points, right? All of these lower scoring game totals when it's all said and done. And then you have a couple games that finish around 49 to 50, and then one game that finishes at 60, 62, 65, whatever it might be. That game is separating so much from the field that it's going to be really hard to win a tournament without being on that one right game. So that might actually lead to our consistency being a little bit lower this year than we've been used to in past years. But our ceiling is going to be just as high or higher, because when you're on that right game, on that right player, you're separating that much more. You're competing against that many fewer entries, and you are increasing your chances of those first place finishes or those high end finishes where you get those top heavy payouts that you're really looking for in DFS. Okay, so actually a couple other things on this. I've heard a couple sharp people. Chris Long talked about this last week. Sam Monsoon and Steve Palazzazzo, who used to be with Pro Football Focus, now they're with the 33rd team. They talked about this last week. Basically, that coordinators probably matter more in this current meta of the NFL than they used to matter. In that, used to be that, you've got these talented players and this talented quarterback, these talented pass catchers, and defenses were not figuring out how to stop them. And so they could just kind of bombs away and take over a game. Whereas now we're in this place where, because of defenses having the upper hand, defensive coordinators matter more, because the defensive coordinators who are not able to have the upper hand are obviously creating opportunities for us to have offensive game environments and DFS that separate. And then offensive coordinators who are able to outmaneuver defensive coordinators have the upper hand and can help us in DFS. So just something to think about. That's a place where we really have an edge, because this is something that's always been one of our edges, is understanding the coaches, the players, the way that those coaches interact with one another to create a game environment. That's something that we've always focused on and understood more than our competition does. And that is becoming a greater and greater edge as we move into this current state of how defenses and offenses are interacting with one another. So all this time that we've put in, understanding the coaches and how these teams try to win games, it's always helped us, but it's going to help us more and more throughout a season like this. Okay, so then that brings me to this week and this idea of, okay, what could separate on this particular slate? What's likely to separate is the Commanders and Cardinals game. But as I talked about, actually two things that could happen that could lead to that game, quote, going wrong. First off, recognize it's a 50-point game total, right? It's not a 58 or 60-point game total. That means that, roughly half the money is saying that this game will finish below 50 combined points. Well, it finishes with 46 combined points. That's probably not winning us a tournament, right? 45 combined points, 24-21 game. That's probably not winning us a tournament. So first off, recognize this is not just like a guaranteed spot. It is the best spot on the slate, but it's not a guaranteed spot. So how does the Arizona side fail? Probably they're going to pick up yards. So if they fail, it's going to be from mistakes. Maybe they just come out and have a bad game. I don't think that's going to happen, because this is a team that is hot, that they're playing a hot team right now. They have every reason to be focused and bring their best effort. They're a 1-2 team that has played really close games against good football teams. And so certainly a game where the Cardinals would like to get on track, get this win, beat this Commanders team. I think that we'll see the Cardinals have their best effort here, but that could happen, right? The Cardinals come out flat and just have a bad game. Likelier is that the Cardinals pick up a lot of yards, but maybe they have those mistakes closer to the end zone and they don't pile up the points. On the other side of the game, really a lot of talk has gone into what a bad defense the Cardinals have, and yet they held the Bills down through the first half of that game against them. The Bills ended up scoring 34 points, but that was all like, maybe it started late in the first half and then throughout the second half that the Bills figured out this defense. Week 2, the Rams, who didn't have Puka Nacua, didn't have their offensive line, but they had Cooper Kupp, and the Cardinals don't have a great pass rush. And Cooper Kupp didn't get hurt till the third quarter, partway through the third quarter in that game. He did nothing before he got hurt. The Cardinals allowed only 10 points to the Rams in that game. And then in week 3, they played Detroit, this incredible Detroit offense. Obviously, Goff hasn't been at his best to start the season, but the Cardinals held the Lions to only 20 points. So last year, Jonathan Gannon got a lot of praise for his ability to scheme defense, his ability to get this kind of talent deficient team ready and willing to play hard week in and week out. They had a couple upsets before Kyler even came back. And then when Kyler was there, they looked like a pretty good team all the way around. And we're seeing that again this year. So on paper, talent-wise, are they the best defense? No. But as we often talk about, defense isn't just about talent. A lot of defense is about the structure of the defense and the communication on the back end. Because if you can have guys who are going to play assignment sound football on the back end, they're going to communicate well. The defensive secondary is going to move on a string together, right? Where the offense is doing this. And so I, as the free safety, know that the keys the cornerback is reading is going to lead to the cornerback going here, is going to lead to the strong safety going here, and I'm supposed to go here, right? And everybody kind of moves together, fulfills their assignments, and forces the opponent to march the field. And a lot of times when you force an opponent to march the field, instead of hitting big plays, they are going to make mistakes throughout the game. They're going to have dropped passes, they're going to have misfires on throws, they're going to take a sack, they're going to have a penalty, something that puts them in that second and long, that third and long, that failed third down conversion, whatever it might be, that prevents them from putting that drive together. You only get, actually some of these games where we've seen a lot more running of the ball, we've been seeing games with like 8 possessions. Typically you get like 10, 11, sometimes 12 possessions in an NFL game. So if you get 10 possessions, every time that you ruin a drive on a mistake, on a penalty, on a sack taken, on an unforced error of some sort, that's a drive where you're not scoring points or where you are limiting the number of points that you are able to score. And so the Cardinals kind of playing defense like that of like, okay, we're going to force you to march the field, and we think that you're going to make enough mistakes that we're going to come out ahead as a result. So there's certainly a possibility here that the Commanders don't put up a lot of points against the Cardinals defense that has held down a couple of good offenses this year. So that's another thing to think about in this spot. This is the top game on the slate, but can it fail? Yes, it can. So if you want to build around a scenario of this game hitting, then you want to build around that scenario. You want to think about, okay, how do I really roll these points together to maximize the value and advantage I get from this game? If you want to bet on this game underwhelming, then you also need to bet on another game that can ascend. So this game ends up with 46 combined points, 44 combined points, whatever it might be, right? And a bunch of other games finish 44 and below. Is there a game that can go for 50, 52, 55, 60, or a game where we can have a bunch of big plays or whatever it might be? So a couple spots that I want to highlight. We'll highlight some other spots in the player grid, but there are two. There's Carolina and Cincinnati, which has a similar game total. And then there's a couple that I'm calling, oh yeah, also. So, oh yeah, also, Jacksonville and Houston could end up being a high scoring game. The Jacksonville offense has not looked good so far. Part of that is because they have built their team for a style of offense that no longer succeeds in the NFL, right? They're not able to run the ball. They don't really have an underneath passing game, and they're trying to throw the ball downfield against defenses that are taking away the downfield throws. But the Texans are well equipped to succeed in this spot. I think they scored, maybe they I guess they lost a game 24-21 against the Jags last year. So they scored 21 one time against the Jags, scored 37 another time against the Jags last year. Certainly 20 plus points is what we should expect from the Texans, but they have clear pathways to scoring 30 plus points. I would expect the Texans to be able to find a way to score 3 touchdowns in this spot, and they have potential to score 4 or more touchdowns. And then the question is, does that mean it's going to be a blowout? And it's easy to look at the way that the Jags played last week on national TV against the Bills and say, oh man, the Jags don't have a chance here if the Texans score points. But remember that the Jags played 2 close games, obviously kind of a bad Browns team or bad Browns offense at this point. But that was a close game, and then a good Dolphins team that still had Tua, had all their healthy pieces. In week 1, they lost 20-17. The Jags' backs are against the wall. Doug Peterson is a Super Bowl winning head coach. Doug Peterson is also a culture guy in that he's able to figure out how to get the players to buy in. I mean, think about the year they won the Super Bowl, right? If Carson Wentz had, crazy to think about given the way that his career went after that, but if Carson Wentz had just finished that season, he was on track to win the MVP that year. He tears his ACL, goes out. Nick Foles comes in. How many teams would have kind of given up on their all-out effort at that point? But this team rallied around Nick Foles and went on to win that Super Bowl. And Doug Peterson has that in him to get buy-in from players. Even the year 2 years ago where Doug Peterson appeared to have turned around this Jags organization, they started that year, I don't remember exactly what their record was, but they started that year not looking like a team that had any shot at going to the playoffs. And then they got really hot throughout the second half of the season, had that huge comeback against the Chargers in the first round of the playoffs, made it to the second round of the playoffs. And so certainly a team at 0-3 that you could see coming out and looking different this week than they have looked. So that's a game that I could see turning into an actual legitimate shootout. That's one of those, oh yeah, also games that we should be thinking about. And then the other, oh yeah, also game for me is Minnesota and Green Bay. With how well the Minnesota defense has been playing, with Jordan Love coming back from injury, I think this is a spot that most people are just going to write off and say that we're probably not going to see a lot of scoring here in this game. And that might very well end up being the case. But these divisional games can get weird at times, and it would not be a total shock if this game ended up having some big plays, some touchdowns, some back and forth, and all of a sudden we look up and this is one of those games of the week type spots. So some spots that we want to be thinking about outside of just that clear top game. There's a few other spots that we can be thinking about that we'll hit on in the player grid as well. But Cardinals Commanders, clearly the top game on the slate. but that does not mean that in the small sample size of 1 week, building around that game is going to prove to be the best way to win. So all of that is to say, again, we want to look through these things through a lens of nuance. I'm not saying don't play that game. I'm not saying play that game. I'm saying understand the various pathways available to a first place finish this week, and then embrace what you're saying with those builds. So if you are building around one of these other games, you're not only saying this game has a shot at 55 plus points, you're also saying, ooh, Cardinals and Commanders could underwhelm. And so think about how you're building around all of that, or accounting for, hey, what if Cardinals Commanders hits and one of these other games hits, and how you would build around that. Have a clear thesis in mind of what you're doing when you build these rosters to maximize your chances of really benefiting from what happens. Last thing I wanted to touch on regarding this slate as a whole, and then we will get to the bottom-up build before we get out of here. Unique running back slate. Obviously, we have the high-end guys. We've got Saquon Barkley, we've got Alvin Kamara, we've got Breece Hall. People will be going to those guys, but there are 5 guys I want to highlight real quickly. 3 of them in one bucket and 2 of them in another. So one bucket is these guys who just have monster roles right now. One of them is Kyren Williams. So we talked about this in DFS interpretations, but the Rams lean on their best players. We've seen it with Cooper Kupp. We saw it when Cooper Kupp was out last year, and it was Puka Nacua and Kyren Williams. We saw it early this year when Puka Nacua went out and Cooper Kupp saw 21 targets. We also know that they entered this season saying, let's give Kyren Williams a little bit more rest throughout the season. Let's try to turn him into like a 65, 70% back instead of a 90% back, because we have playoff aspirations. I mean, some people were putting the Rams in as like a dark horse Super Bowl contender this year. Probably not going to happen with how quickly those injuries piled up. And, the absence of Aaron Donald has been felt on the defense, I think, more than people anticipated. Kobe Turner, who was kind of viewed as maybe this ascending defensive tackle who, nobody's Aaron Donald, but could kind of step up and be a force. It's kind of looked so far like, the attention that Aaron Donald drew certainly was a big part of why Kobe Turner looked so good last year. But maybe not a Super Bowl contender, but a good team, right? It was like we definitely see ourselves going to the playoffs. They went to the playoffs last year, and we want Kyren healthy when we get to that point. Let's use him on about 70% of the snaps, and they did that in week 1. And Ronnie Rivers worked in a bunch, and then we kind of saw last week that the Rams were like, well, we don't have Kupp, we don't have Nacua. This plan has to go out the window. Kyren Williams played, I think it was 89% of snaps last week, saw all but 2 running back touches, had 24 carries, had 2 targets. Also, Matthew Stafford threw the ball only 25 times. So that was 25 pass attempts, 24 carries for Kyren Williams. So I would expect Kyren Williams to be central to this offense once again. And then 2 other spots, similar setups, right, where we're seeing a larger running back volume. And I love betting on volume at running back, and that is Brian Robinson and Najee Harris. So with Najee Harris, Cordero Patterson's there. He's going to get some touches, but I don't think that Cordero Patterson is going to take on the full Jaylen Warren role. It looks like Jaylen Warren will miss this week. We know that the Steelers like to run the ball. They're playing a Colts team that has been incapable of stopping the run outside of their game against the Bears, who have no offensive line and can't move bodies in the run game. 2 weeks ago, we saw the Colts just stay in their normal defense and allow the Packers to run all over them with Josh Jacobs and Malik Willis. So I like this spot for Najee Harris in terms of volume and opportunity from a matchup perspective. And then Brian Robinson Jr., obviously he's going to cede some touches to Jeremy McNichols, but I would very much expect the Commanders to just say, how much can Brian Robinson handle? And let's keep him out in the field for that much of the game. Austin Eckler, short-term injury, it's a concussion. So expectation would be that by week 5, he's back healthy. And so it's not like the Commanders have to say, hey, look, we have to adapt to a new way of life here in the backfield and figure out what we're going to do in this RB2 role. Instead, they can say, look, it's just 1 week. Can Brian Robinson handle an 85, 90% snap share on this 1 week? So I could see him being involved more heavily than he has been to this point in the season. So those are some interesting pieces where just the volume, and not to argue against any of the other good running back plays on the slate, but I love betting on volume. You guys know that if you've been around here. And so these are 3 guys who volume and role really stand out to me this week. It gives them a higher floor than some of the other running backs are going to have. Other running backs have similar point per dollar ceilings, but in terms of floor ceiling range, I really like these guys. And then bottom end and I like them, but more importantly, I wanted to highlight like some of the unique components of this slate. So one of the things we like to use the Angle podcast for. And then bottom of the pricing range, D'Onta Foreman, we brought him up last week. We also brought him up 2 weeks ago. Last week he had, I think, 2 carries. 2 weeks ago he had 14 carries. So we can remember that when the Browns control games, there are opportunities there for D'Onta Foreman to control this backfield. So again, 14 carries in week 2 in that game that the Browns controlled. So the idea, and I touched on this in the player grid and also in DFS interpretations. And DFS interpretation, I went through some of these games that D'Onta Foreman has had over the last 2 years, and it's like he had negative 0.6 points in a game. I think it was last year or maybe it was 2 years ago, where he had like 6 carries for negative 6 rushing yards, right? And that was his stat line. That was what he provided for you. He took away points from your roster if you played him that week. And he'll have games like that where it's like 2 points, 1 point, 0 points, negative something points, healthy scratch, 20 points on 16 carries. 25 points on 19 carries, right? And so D'Onta Foreman is capable of that type of performance, and he pairs really nicely with the Browns defense, because if the Browns defense is having a big game here, then that puts the Browns in front. That opens opportunities for D'Onta Foreman. It's one of those spots where the running back and defense are really heavily correlated in how they could play off each other. So D'Onta Foreman is one of these cheaper guys who could kill your roster. He's probably best only for large field play. He could kill your roster, but also could be a big help at really low ownership. And then Roschon Johnson, who, reports came out from Jeremy Fowler this week of ESPN that the Bears want to give an extended look to Roschon Johnson. So we have seen reports like this lead to nothing in the past, but we've also seen reports like this prove to be true. And so that's something to think about in tournaments. Just a couple of interesting spots where Roschon Johnson, and I talked about this on my block party show with Pete Overzet, but the issue with the Bears is they can't block anybody. And so then you have a running back like DeAndre Swift, who is always looking for the home run swing. That's kind of the knock against him, is he's not good at just getting the ball and going north and south. He's always looking for the big play. Well, if your offensive line can't block, that just means getting tackled in the backfield a lot. So we saw last week, Roschon Johnson had 8 carries, looked much better than DeAndre Swift because he's fine taking the ball and saying, okay, there's nothing here. Let me plow ahead for 2 yards. There's nothing here. Let me plow ahead for 3 yards. And sometimes when you do that enough times, it's like, there's nothing here. Let me plow ahead. Oh, a hole just opened up, and I just got 16 yards out of this run. And so Roschon Johnson, a good pass catching back and capable on the ground, and kind of fits what the Bears need right here. It's hard for a team to truly, in week 4 of the season, take a high-priced free agent acquisition and say, yeah, you're not getting that many touches this week. So I don't fully buy this, but I buy it enough that I want to pay attention to the Roschon Johnson component on the week and have him on some of my tournament builds. So just some unique running back setups here. That's not to argue for or against any other running backs on the slate, but kind of 3 guys I wanted to highlight from a volume perspective. And then a couple of these cheap guys who are just really interesting this week. Okay, last thing we're going to do here is hit the bottom up build. So for those of you who are new here, bottom up build, the idea is build a roster with a salary cap of $44K. That allows us to explore some of the value on the slate. Also, it allows us to talk through strategy components. One of the coolest things we see, we have a bottom up build contest on OWS. The rules are simple. It's free to enter, build with a $44K salary cap. We have real money prizes in terms of money that you can spend on OWS, free courses and whatnot for the winners. And again, it's free. It's a good exercise. It helps you kind of sharpen your brain. And one of the coolest things we've seen over the years is all these 200-point scores from people building with a $44K salary cap. I think I saw this last week. I wish I'd jotted down the name, but I think I saw this last week that the winner of last week's bottom-up build contest said that his bottom-up build contest was his best roster of the weekend. So sometimes we can see these $44K salary cap rosters putting up huge scores and even better scores than we're putting up with our $50K salary cap roster. So it's just a really good exercise for our brains to see how we can build for upside while using a lot less in salary. And then a lot of times you can find one of these rosters where it's like, oh, and I had to take this 3K player that I really don't like that much, and I could just pivot off of him to this 9K player or this 8,500 player in this defense that I like more, and all of a sudden I've got a great roster to play around with. So you can find the link to the bottom-up build contest in my player grid. You can find the link in our Discord in the BUB contest channel. If you're not on the OWS Discord, you can find that in the OWS and NFL drop-down menus on the site. We have over 5,000 users who are active in that Discord. A lot of our team is active in Discord, so it's a really great place. Given that we've spent years focused on training DFS strategy theory, how to build sharper DFS rosters plus EV DFS rosters. We have an incredibly sharp community that's hanging out in there talking about the slate throughout the week. So that's also a great place to hang out, whether you are an OWS subscriber or not. Okay, so this week's bottom up build, what I wanted to do was I wanted to hit on this. I wanted to fit in this player block from Arizona that I really like this week. So I've got my show with Squirrel Patrol in 12 minutes and it airs live, so I can't spend too much time on this, but let's see what we can get to in terms of hitting on this player block. This player block is obviously touched on in the player grid as well, and we touched on it in the show with Pete today as well, but this player block, I'm calling it the works, and it is Kyler Murray plus James Conner plus Marvin Harrison Jr. So going back to week 1, the Buccaneers played the Commanders. Buccaneers had that split backfield, Bucky Irving and Rachaad White. But if we just take, quote, running back from Tampa, plus wide receiver 1, which you could actually say Mike Evans or Chris Godwin. Evans outscored Godwin by, I think it was 1 DraftKings point that week, but I'll call Mike Evans the wide receiver 1. Mike Evans, or wide receiver 1, plus backfield plus quarterback, combined for 78 DraftKings points from 3 players on the Bucs that week. Go to week 2. Giants offense, not nearly as good as the Bucs, not nearly as good as the Cardinals, not nearly as good as the Bengals, the team that the Commanders played in week 3. Giants offense with Daniel Jones at quarterback. Take quarterback, running back, Devin Singletary, and wide receiver 1, Malik Neighbors. Combined for around 66 DraftKings points. And then go to week 3, take quarterback, Burrow, backfield, which is Chase Brown and Zach Moss splitting touches, and wide receiver 1 in Jamar Chase, combined for 92 DraftKings points. So a couple things at play here. As we always say, anytime you get 30 points from a player, it's really valuable regardless of what you paid for it. Anytime you get 25, 26 points from a player, that's really valuable almost regardless of what you paid for it. These 3 players, Kyler, James Conner, Marvin Harrison Jr., they cost $20.8K combined. So in order to keep you on a 200-point pace, you would need right around 80 points. Well, week 1, quarterback, backfield, wide receiver 1 combined for 78. Week 3 combined for 92. That keeps you on a tournament-winning pace if we get that, right? That's like saying I'm averaging 26 points per player, or I'm averaging 30, almost 31 points per player from this block of 3 players. Extraordinarily valuable. And then with the salary to match, where it's like, and it's 4X, it's truly keeping you on a 200-plus point pace. And even in that Daniel Jones, Devin Singletary, Malik Neighbors week, obviously Neighbors, an extremely talented wide receiver, but Devin Singletary, Daniel Jones, not on par with Kyler and James Conner. Well, even in that week, it was 66 points, which that's like averaging 22 points per player. And it's hard to get, especially in today's NFL, the way the games are shaking out, it's hard to get 22 points per player, right? So just so much value in the way that teams have been able to pile up production against Washington through their main weapons. And this is something that most people will not be playing this week, obviously, especially not in the 44K contest. Now that changes because as we always say, this is an OWS contest, the bottom up build contest. And so most people have then listened to this podcast and picked up ideas from here. But if we think about, even just the main slate with a 50K salary cap, most people won't have this block. And then if there were a true 44K salary cap contest, most people would not have this block. So just a really fun way to play that game. We'll talk about it more in the player grid. Trying to get some savings now. I threw in Noah Brown on this roster. Noah Brown, seeing more and more time on the field for Washington. Not a high floor play, but honestly, no pass catchers on Washington are high floor plays. Jaden Daniels has 23, 24, and 27 pass attempts, 29 pass attempts, something like that, in like a shootout, a game where they were chasing points. Like, he's not throwing the ball a ton. It's hard for any pass catcher on that offense to see more than 6 targets. Terry McLaurin had that big game last week, but 6 targets was his official target count. And so Noah Brown, 3 targets last week, 3 targets the week before, certainly could step up in this spot and have a nice game against the Cardinals, especially if this block of Cardinals pieces is putting up points and forcing the Commanders to stay aggressive throughout. A couple other salary savers on this roster. It's a pretty thin week for salary. We'll hit on some more of these cheaper pieces that I like in the player grid, or cheaper pieces that I can stomach. But a couple guys I want to mention here. Brenton Strange at tight end, 3,100. He has 11 targets across the last 2 weeks. And again, the Jags are going to need to find a way to work underneath a little bit in order to sustain drives. And so Brenton Strange should once again see that 5+ targets that he's been seeing recently. He's only 3,100. And then Little Jordan Humphrey. So I might have been the only person to play Little Jordan Humphrey last week. I played him on about 10% of my roster. So that was because I had Devon Bailey on a little over 10% of my rosters last week. We talked about Bailey, I think, on this show last week. I touched on him in the player grid, but Bailey played the majority of the slot snaps for the Broncos in week 1. He played like 2/3 of them, and Lil Jordan Humphrey played the other third of those snaps. Bailey had 8 targets, caught 8 passes for 39 yards. He was only 3,400. He missed week 2 with an injury and was practicing leading up to week 3. So the expectation was, Bailey will come back and step into a similar role. After practicing all week, he ended up being inactive. So I'm deeming that to be a healthy scratch, not a carryover from the injury. When Bailey missed in week 2, Lil Jordan Humphrey played almost all of those slot snaps. So I just took all my Bailey, pivoted down to Lil Jordan Humphrey last week because, again, it's not pretty, but week 1, that role, Bailey had the role in week 1, 8 catches for 39 yards. Week 2, Lil Jordan Humphrey, 4 catches for 50 yards on 5 targets. So week 3, again, 30, what was he last week? 3K, Lil Jordan Humphrey, 3K, 0% ownership, 6 catches, 37 yards, 8 targets. Does that win you a tournament? No, right? It's been 11.9 points from Bailey in week 1, 9 points from Lil Jordan Humphrey in week 2, 9.7 points in week 3. But this role has produced 9 to 12 points in all 3 games so far. Throw in a touchdown, and all of a sudden that's 15 to 18 points. So at this low price tag with nobody on them on a week with really thin value, I think he's an interesting option. You could have to pivot on Sunday morning because maybe Bailey's active this week and then throws a wrench into what we're doing here. But I think Lil Jordan Humphrey's a more interesting play than most people will give him credit for. And then another salary saver, because again, we went up to Marvin Harrison, we went up to Kyler Murray, we went up to James Conner. I throw Roschon Johnson on here. We touched on him already. Kind of a low probability bet, but a really interesting bet. I also tested out Deontay Foreman and the Browns on here. I went ahead and threw the Saints defense on here. Saints defense has been lights out. The Falcons offensive line, not a good pass protecting line. Kirk Cousins doesn't have any mobility. So I think that's an interesting play. And I needed to do that to make the salary work. So right now, from what we've touched on so far, the roster is Kyler Murray, James Conner, Roschon Johnson, Marvin Harrison Jr., Noah Brown, Lil Jordan Humphrey, Brenton Strange, and the Saints defense, which brings us to the flex spot. We have $6K in salary left over. There's lots of different ways we could have gone here, but a player I just wanted to touch on really quickly in this format, Travis Kelce. So Travis Kelce, 5,800. He's averaging 5 DraftKings points per game this year. But we have to remember that teams adapt and adjust throughout the season. There are going to be some Travis Kelce games this season. Last year, his production wasn't this low, but it was low. And then there were these people, everybody jumped off Travis Kelce, and then there were these random Travis Kelce games. So I want to be aware that Kelce still has that within his range of outcomes. Now, as I also pointed out this week, Kelce's only 6 months younger than Rob Gronkowski, who's been fully retired for over 2 years now, and that's his second retirement, right? So like Kelce's getting up there in age, but Kelce is still going to be a critical part of this offense in some games. And so I could see this being one of those games. He's only 5,800, and what really makes him valuable this week isn't just that, oh yeah, he can hit for a big game and he's cheap and people aren't on him, but it's that everybody wants to play Rashee Rice. And so as always, we want to think about not just, does this player help our rosters? And if a player is really obvious to us and can help our roster in a big way, we like that. But if a player is kind of like, yeah, he could have a big game, he could also fail. Kelce can also fail. So what really pushes them over the top for me is the fact that if he hits, he's extremely valuable because he's not only getting you points that most people aren't getting, Kelce's going to be low owned, but he's also taking away points from Rashee Rice, who a lot of other people will have. So if 20% of rosters have Rashee Rice and you're hurting 20% of the tournament field while also getting points that only 4, 5, 6% of the tournament field is getting, you are helping yourself so much. That's so much leverage that you're gaining. So Travis Kelce, somebody I wanted to throw in here just to give us an opportunity to talk about him. He wraps up this roster. That is 43.8K in salary spent. That's 6.2K left over. Lots of fun stuff we can do this week. Again, think about all the stuff that we talked about here and the unique components of the slate and how we might be able to outmaneuver the field for those first place finishes. With that, I'm going to get out of here. I will see you, as always, on the site throughout the weekend, and I will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.